Yeah. Okay, so please go.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay.
The stage is
Hi,
yours.
everybody. Yeah, let's start the presentation. You can already see the topic. Yeah. So we are going to talk about the phenomenon known as isomorphism effect one more time. That is the strong preference of young children for surface scope interpretation of ambiguous sentences containing negation and a quantifier. Yeah, like every horse didn't jump off the fence because like we've already seen, children and adults have opposite interpretative preferences. Yeah, adults have a strong preference, I guess, for inverse scope, and that is when, in this case with horse, the negation takes scope over the universal quantifier. Like, not every horse jumped off the fence, and children display a strong preference for surface scope. Yeah, so we're going to talk about this phenomenon, and we're going to see that under certain conditions, this effect observed in children represents an exaggerated, that is overstated, yeah, interpretative preference also observed in adults. Yeah, and furthermore, we will see that under certain conditions, adults can also be turned into children and display this isomorphism effect. Yeah, not only children, but also adults. And finally, yeah, we're gonna see that the same contextual factors that enable children to override this isomorphism effect, that is this, one more time, the surface scope preference, have a similar effect on adults. Okay, so let's start with experiments. Yeah. So in this first experiment was tested adults' interpretation of ambiguous sentences like Cookie Monster didn't eat 2 slices of pizza, like in previous presentations. Yeah, so we have 10 adult native speakers of English as participants, and the main goal, you can already see, the main goal is to find out whether adults display any preference for narrow or wide scope interpretations. And that's why they were placed in a situation in which both readings were true. Yeah. So as a methodology was used as truth value judgment test, that is making a judgment about whether a statement is true in a given context. Yeah, am I right? Yeah. And we have a sentence with a numerically quantified object and a negation. So here is the context. We have a Cookie Monster and 3 slices of pizza, like we've already seen in previous presentation. And 3 slices of pizza from which he ate only 1. So both surface and inverse scope readings are true, right? Like, it's not the case that Cookie Monster ate 2 slices of pizza. That's true. And there was surface scope. And inverse scope, there are 2 slices that Cookie Monster didn't eat. Also true. Yeah, so what we've got, so the relevant finding here is that adults, like children, display a strong preference for this narrow, that is, in this case, surface scope reading. Yeah. Of sentences like this, due to the fact that 75% of participants' justifications were of the narrow or surface scope kind. Like, Puppet is right because Cookie Monster ate only 1 slice, not 2. So we have here a clear surface scope preference.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
So, if this context is compatible with both scope interpretation, right?
Yeah.
How did they investigate this, the scope preference of their participants? Just relying on their justifications?
That's a good question. So the puppet was asking a question like, Cookie Monster didn't eat 2 slices of pizza. Is that right? Please explain that.
Mm-hmm.
And that the participants were saying like, yeah, the puppet is right because Cookie Monster didn't eat 2 slices of pizza. Yeah, so we have here a clear surface scope preference, not inverse scope. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I understand this. So what would be the justification that, I don't know, that says that actually he had a surface scope preference, right? So if they said, yeah, he didn't eat, he only ate 1, right? Yeah. That would be a justification for the surface scope. And if they would say, he didn't eat those 2 pieces, that would be justification for the inverse scope?
I mean, like I've understood, that was due to the explanations, like, does that right? Please explain it. And then producers were saying like, yeah, the puppet is right because Cookie Monster ate only 1 slice, not 2. So here's the surface scope. I mean,
I'm not arguing against your explanation. I'm arguing against,
it was not my explanation. It was
I'm arguing against the methodology of this paper. Like, so my problem with this is that even if I had I'm trying to understand this, right? So if I had, let's say that I have a surface scope preference, right? So let's say that I interpret this sentence as not 2, right?
Yeah.
So he didn't eat 2, he only ate 1, right? And then again, I say not 2. So in fact, he didn't eat those 2 that would have made this sentence false, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm arguing is that I'm not really sure that you can infer safely the preference or the intended interpretation of someone just by relying on its justification, because these justifications are actually compatible with both configurations, right?
I see, but I can explain it to you because you know how confused I was from this paper. I'm just presenting it.
Yeah. So
you're right.
Yeah. So only you can explain this to me because I didn't understand it from the paper. So please, go on.
Yeah. So, can I go on or?
Please, sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Consider the pictures, and let's go to the second experiment.
Right.
Yeah. Consider the pictures and sentence 2 frogs didn't jump over the rock. Yeah, now we have 20 adult native English speakers, and we are gonna see whether this isomorphism effect, that is, one more time, the preference that children have for surface scope interpretations, can also be seen by adults. Yeah, truth value judgment task as before, and we have a sentence with numerically quantified subject, not object, in this case, and a negation. But in contrast to the first experiment, we now have 2 conditions. So in the first condition, the wide scope or surface scope, in this case, reading is true, and the narrow or inverse one is false. Like, consider the first picture. Wide scope, surface scope reading says that there are 2 frogs that didn't jump over the rock. Yeah, that's true. Whereas the narrow scope, inverse scope reading says that it's not the case that 2 frogs jumped over the rock, and that's false. Yeah, in fact, they did. And now consider the second picture. In this case, the truth conditions are inversed and wide scope is false and narrow scope is true, because here it's not the case that two frogs jumped over the rock, but one of them did. Yeah. And yeah, so these were two conditions. So now let's see whether adults do in fact have this isomorphism effect. There's whether they accept this surface scope interpretation, like in picture 1. Yeah. So I must say that the measure was the proportion of yes responses to the puppet statements, and in 100% of the time in the conditions in which the wide scope or surface scope reading, which says that there are two frogs that didn't jump over the rock, like in picture 1, was true. And the narrow or inverse scope reading was true only in, I guess, 27 and 5%, yeah. In the conditions in which the narrow scope reading was true, like in picture 2. So we can conclude that the so-called isomorphism effect can also be found by adults. Do you have any questions? Any explanations?
No. Yeah. So what was the data again for the inverse scope condition, right?
More time?
Yeah, so the 100% refers to the
surface scope,
right?
And inverse scope was, I guess, 27 and 5%
of acceptance.
Yeah. Why do I talk
of the adults? So the adults basically accepted always the surface scope, and they did not like the inverse scope, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
So we have a clear surface scope preference. So we can conclude that adults display this isomorphism effect. Yeah, that was the second experiment. Yeah, let's go to the third one. Okay, we have seen that adults as well as children have this isomorphism effect. Yeah. So now let's try to overrule this effect by contextual factors. Yeah, again, 20 participants. And yeah, we are gonna observe whether the same contextual factors that help children to override their isomorphic tendency, yeah, would have a similar effect on adults. Yeah, truth value judgment test as before, but at this time we have an affirmative statement followed by a negative one, because like from previous presentation, it has been claimed that negative statements are easier to process when they are preceded by affirmative statements. Yeah, like by children, I guess the adult-like interpretation, that is the inverse scope interpretation of sentences like every horse didn't jump over the fence was really facilitated when they were preceded by affirmative statements. But anyway, so in this, in contrast to the second experiment, the puppet statements are now all preceded by affirmative statements. Yeah, and we have, as before, two conditions. In condition 1, we're used the same materials as in experiment 2, like in the second picture, here in the second pictures. Yeah. And that's in order to repeat the results. And in condition 2, we have both affirmative and negative statements. And let's see what we have. In condition 1, we see the same results, yeah, that of experiment 2, that is adults only accepted the puppet statement, yeah, 27 and 5% of the time. Yeah, that means they didn't have a preference for inverse scope interpretation. But on contrary, in condition 2, with both affirmative and negative statements, the acceptance rate grew really up to 92, yeah, 92 and 5%. So the inverse scope reading was now Exactly, and the isomorphism effect was overridden, and now we have clear inverse co-breeding preference, like 2 frogs jumped over the fence, but it's not the case that 2 frogs jumped over the rock, yeah, because only one of them did. Yeah, so the relevant finding here is that the same contextual factors helping children to override their isomorphic bias have a same effect on adults, now turning to children. Shall I do a summary? Or?
Can I ask you one thing?
Yeah.
You know, I'm very slow at computing these things on fly. So, so the idea is that adding the context, right? The 2 frogs jumped over the fence thing,
yeah,
would be able to facilitate the inverse scope interpretation for that, right?
Yes.
Oh, right, of course, because negation is downstream.
Yeah.
So, of
That's
course.
all because this affirmative.
Right. Sorry, I was already reading that with an inverse scope. Right. So just to explain it for I mean, I guess you're faster than me, but the idea is right is that the didn't would move before the 2, so that the result would be it is not true that 2 frogs, blah 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 blah, only one did. Cool.
Yeah, like 2 frogs jumped over the fence, but it's not the case that 2 frogs jumped over the rock. Yeah, because only one of them did.
Yeah.
Surface code.
Yeah.
Shall I do a summary, or we're up?
Oh, please. Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Is there any question by the other people by any chance? You know, I'm bothering the speakers with my questions, but if you want to bother the speakers as well, you're welcome to do it.
Hopefully not.
Okay, then.
Okay. Yeah, so let's summarize all the relevant findings just briefly. So, yeah, we saw that isomorphism effect represents this exaggerated preference in sentences like, I guess this nominal phrase, negation, verb, and a quantified object by adults. And we saw that adults have also this isomorphism effect, and that the same contextual factors helping children to override their isomorphic bias. In this case, negation, in this case, affirmative statement followed by a negation can also help adults to override this isomorphism effect. Yeah, that's it.
Very good. Thanks a lot. If I can just make a comment about your presentation, one thing that is useful is to always add the numbers of the main results, or like a, you know,
I guess I have this.
A graph of something. Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Like
here for a surface code.
Right. So also for the other condition would be helpful. The 25%, right?
Yeah.
And also in the second experiment, when they move from 27 to 90 something, that would also be useful.
Yeah, you're right.
But yeah, excellent work. Thanks so much, Annie. It was really clear and well done. Okay, so if anyone has any question or anything to ask or anything to talk about, please speak now, or we can proceed to the next presentation.
Okay. I'll be back in a minute and I can turn on my video, okay?
Yep. I guess we can go with Johanna.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. I will talk about the paper Scope Ambiguity in Child Language, Old and New Problems, which was written by Guilmini. And the paper is concerned with the resolution of scope ambiguity in child language, with focus on the role of pragmatic factors, and also with the focus on the fact that this domain involves different linguistic levels. And Guglielmini first presents this influential experiment by Musolino that we already saw a few times. And Musolino wanted to find out whether children have access to the inverse scope interpretation with the sentences that you can see now, which all include a negation and a quantifier. And the children were presented with context that made the inverse scope interpretation of these sentences true. So for example, for the first sentence, we already saw this scenario where 2 horses already jumped over the fence, but one hadn't. And the results were that the children denied the inverse scope interpretation and preferred the surface scope. And Musolino proposed to explain this phenomenon through the idea of isomorphism, and assumed that children choose the surface scope interpretation to a larger extent than adults do. And therefore, it was necessary to find distinct factors that are responsible for this difference. And Musolino assumed that children would use the inverse scope interpretation if they could access it because of the principle of cooperation and the maxim of quality. So he assumes that that the inverse scope interpretation is not available for them because children have never learned the existence of these interpretations, and so they have no access to them. And he also assumes that the difference lies in the particular grammar that children and adults entertain. Now we move on to some data that refines Musolino's assumptions and theory and shows evidence against the view of isomorphism. And this was made by Guglielmini in 2003 and 2004. And the studies demonstrate that children can access both interpretations. And Guglielmini drew upon the assumption that negative sentences are used to show a discrepancy between the expected outcome and the actual outcome. And to test if expectations can mitigate the children's difficulty with the inverse scope interpretation, he confronted them with stories. For example, this one, where a troll had to deliver 4 pizzas, and on his way, 2 pizzas fell off the delivery truck. And after the children heard the story, they had to evaluate the following sentences. The troll didn't deliver some pizzas, and the troll didn't lose some pizzas. And of course, the both sentences are true under consideration on the inverse scope interpretation. And 30, 4, and 5-year-old children participated in this experiment. And in 90%, they accepted the sentence 1, but only in 50% they accepted sentence 2. And this shows that the children can access both interpretation, and that a specific context lets the children to access the inverse scope interpretation to a higher extent than observed in previous literature. Musolino thought that it is not even possible for them to access it, and Guglielmini shows that they can access both interpretations in specific contexts.
Okay, wait, can I stop you a second? Yeah. Because I need some time to, can you go back to the example?
Yeah.
Thank you. So the first sentence is the troll didn't deliver some pizzas, right? And what happened was that he had to deliver 4 pizzas and 2 pizzas fell. Yeah. So you only deliver some of them, right? So he did deliver some of them and he didn't deliver the other 2, basically, right? Yeah. So this sentence would be true under the inverse scope interpretation, right? So there are some pizzas that he didn't deliver. But he's claiming that it would not be true in the under the surface scope interpretation, what some has narrow scope with respect to negation, right? Because that would be not some, which is none, right? Yeah. Okay. And the second one, it's the same thing, but it's changing the predicate, right? So lose has the opposite meaning of deliver, right? So this was harder for me because lose has a kind of covert negation, right? So the troll did not lose some pizzas. Under the inverse scope interpretation would be that there are some pizzas that the troll didn't lose, right? Which are the 2 ones that he managed to deliver. But under the surface scope, it would be that he didn't lose any pizza at all. So that would be false, right? And here, the adults or children, sorry?
The children.
Children, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They only accepted these sentences 50% of time. So they were kind of undecided.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. Another evidence against the view of isomorphism comes from Musolino and Lidz. I think we already heard about them on Monday. And they demonstrated that children can access both interpretations in sentences like every horse didn't jump over the fence, and they access the and they are choosing the inverse scope interpretation in sentences like every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence to a higher extent. And this led to the findings that children's behavior changes across contexts, and this view the original view of isomorphism was again challenged. And they also argued that the adult's preference for the inverse scope interpretation has a pragmatic reason. Adults interpret sentences like every horse didn't jump over the fence as not all the horses jumped over the fence, because there is another way to say that no horse jumped over the fence, namely the sentence no horse jumped over the fence. And they also proposed that children prefer surface scope interpretations over true inverse scope interpretations, although they have access to them. And yet all the studies that we heard seem to share the assumption that the difference between children and adults is that children prefer the surface scope and adults prefer the inverse scope. But a new working strategy was to see if contextual factors can help children in overcoming their default tendency. For example, the study by Halsey, Hawkworth, Fox, and Gulmini in 2004 called the question-answer requirement. They asked children a question, for example, did the troll deliver all the pizzas? And the children had to select the scope interpretation which which allows them to answer this question. In the case of the troll didn't deliver some pizzas, both interpretations entail an answer to the question, and the children can make use of the principle of charity and can use the best interpretation for this question. And in case of the troll didn't lose some pizzas, only the surface scope addresses the relevant question and the principle of charity is violated, and the children have to select the only relevant interpretation. And a prediction of this model is that for any context, children prefer the same interpretation, regardless of whether it amounts to the surface scope or to the inverse scope. And they corroborated this prediction by testing children's interpretation on the following sentences. Some pizzas were not delivered and some pizzas were not lost. And the results were that all the English-speaking children accepted sentence 1, but half of them rejected sentence 2, and that closely mirrors the rate that we saw before. And a control group with adults accepted both sentences, and this shows that the difference between children and adults does not take the shape that isomorphism expected. The results show that children can select the inverse scope interpretation. For example, in this case, it is not the case that some pizzas were lost in the same context in which adults select the surface scope interpretation. And the way that children resolve ambiguity has still much debate, but a different issue has been overlooked, namely the fact that children maybe have access to an ambiguity adults don't. And under this assumption, children may be facing a learnability problem, and children's development must include the expansion of one reading. And a proposal was made by Gulmini and Schwarz in 2007, and they used this dialogue where speaker A says, some pizzas were not lost, and speaker B says, well, no pizza was lost. And speaker A's utterance is in this case uncooperative, because some receives wide scope over the negation, and therefore the proposition that some pizzas were not lost triggers the implication that some pizzas were indeed lost. But this implication is not met in this context, since no pizza was lost. And if some could receive narrow scope below the negation, speaker A's utterance would be true and cooperative, but speaker B cannot generate this meaning. So speaker B has no choice but to access the interpretation gives rise to such an implicature. And any witness to this dialogue who cannot compute scalar implicature would not be able to understand the sense of speaker B's reply, because speaker B's reply is in fact consistent with the surface scope interpretation of speaker A's utterance. And given that young children often been reported not to compute scalar implicatures, the consequences for the learner are, even though the relevant information might be there at the initial stages of language development, children might not be able to use it. And only when they are able to compute scalar implicature, they can draw and understand dialogues like this. And maybe this also explains why 5-year-old children are able to interpret some in the scope of negation to a larger extent than adults do. And this reasoning has far-reaching consequences, and the idea that children might be able to bootstrap from syntax to semantic and from semantic to syntax has generated a great body of research. Yes. And to summarize this, Gulmini discusses in his article issues regarding the scope ambiguity, for example, whether children have access, and if yes, to what extent. And he also mentions that the interaction between the different linguistic levels is a problem, because it makes the researcher's task really hard, but it also has benefits, for example, that the learner might have access to multiple sources of information. And in the end of his article, he just says that there is still a lot of research potential left. Yes.
All right, thanks a lot. What a mess, right? So the conclusion of all this mess is basically that Gualmini quit academia. So it doesn't work in linguistics anymore, or in developmental psychology, whereas Musolino doesn't work on scope ambiguity anymore. So basically, both of them gave up with the sort of the enterprise of explaining this phenomenon. I think some of Musolino's students actually still work on scope ambiguity, right? But not him directly. So you see, there are a lot of problems, right? There are a lot of problems and a lot of things that are hard to explain. And I guess that we haven't made much progress from these papers that were written more than 10 years ago, right? So you see that there is still a lot of room for discovery and for thinking. Also, but the nice thing that kind of emerged from both your presentations is that scope ambiguity is not an isolated phenomenon, right? So especially this paper by Gualmini really highlighted the fact that pragmatics, informativity, things like question and discussion, but also scalar implicators, right? So Gricean implicators of the kind that we talked about last time may interact with scope shift and scope ambiguity issues, right? So yeah, so before taking a break, what do you think about this? So I would like to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the contextual facilitation effect that Annie discussed, and what do you think to these sort of pragmatics effects that Gualmini discusses? And do you have any preference, any comment, any critique, any thought? Please tell me what you think. And yeah, especially, you know, the today's speakers, but also anyone else. But I would like to hear some some thoughts from the students, if you have any feeling about this. No? So, like, did you like these papers that you had to read, Annie and Joanna?
I think it was a little complicated at the beginning, but then after I read it 2-3 times, it was okay for me, and yes, I liked it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Annie, what about you? I can see you, but it's okay. Yeah.
Should I be honest?
So yes, please be honest. Yeah, don't worry. We are gonna cancel these videos after the course is over. So these people are not gonna be able to track us down. Okay. I'm kidding.
I was just confused, you know. He said contradictory facts, and that's why I just couldn't tap it in my mind and understand it fully.
Mm-hmm.
That's why.
So can you give me an example of one contradictory fact or something that you felt was contradictory?
I guess I've wrote you about in my first experiment, he said that adults also display this isomorphism effect. Yeah. And that at the end, he said that in sentences like Cookie Monster didn't eat 2 slices of pizza, only children can display this isomorphism effect. How can I understand that? He had just said that adults can also display this isomorphic.
Right. So one of the problems of the whole idea of isomorphism, right, is that, and I also get into troubles with this, with the last paper that I submitted. I got a very bad review by someone, probably from Musolino's group, but I don't know, that told me that I was using isomorphism as an hypothesis, but isomorphism is not an hypothesis, it was an observation, basically, right? So the idea is that isomorphism was really the observation that children could only access the surface scope reading of this sentence, every horse didn't jump over the fence, right? But then, the problem is that, so what happens if anyone, like if an adult, for instance, has a surface scope interpretation of a sentence, right? That's completely accessible, that's completely fine. We should always be able to access a surface scope interpretation of a sentence, because we like to interpret, at least to access one interpretation according to which the words are interpreted according to their order, right? So one of the problems is, like, why do you call isomorphism a tendency just to do what our surface grammar tells us to do, right? So that generates confusion. So about whether isomorphism is this particular behavior of children who cannot access the inverse scope interpretation, or if it's just a normal tendency of interpreting sentences according to their linear order, right? And these problems, they also survive in the modern, in the more modern, more recent studies. So I have 2 problems. I have two theoretical issues about the stuff that you presented, okay? And these issues are about the kind of quantifiers that have been used in the experiments, okay? So one of these problems is about the numerals, right? So in 2 days ago's presentation, if you remember, we had all this discussion about whether numerals are interpreted according to their, indefinites in general, according to their specific or non-specific interpretation. right? So if numerals are ambiguous between a specific and non-specific interpretation, that adds another level of complexity.
Yeah.
Because then you would expect them to behave as definites when they are specific and as indefinites when they are non-specific, right? Now, if you remember from the discussion we had about Fox and Meyer and Spector's paper, right? We discussed the idea that you can only have inverse scope when the result of the process of scope shift gives you a weaker or semantically independent interpretation, right? So, so this is an issue, a factor that was not really considered in this kind of experiments, I guess, at least not from what I remember, and so in the numeral examples, right, the troll did not deliver 2 pizzas, right? The numerals, of course, in object position. So in that case, it should give rise to inverse scope, right? And we can do that later on the blackboard if you want. So that is fine. And the same thing happens with sum, right? So sum, according to Fox and Spector and Meyer, if it's in the narrow scope position with respect to negation. So if it's like in the object position, right? Then if you should give rise to inverse scope, because inverse scope is going to give you a weaker meaning, right? Because not some is kind of logically equivalent to none, which is the strongest meaning possible. So that's fine. However, there is one problem with English, which is that some is a PPI. So some is not supposed to be even able to be interpreted under negation. So in English, if you say, I didn't eat some of the cookies, right? You're not even supposed to be able to access the surface scope interpretation, because some cannot be interpreted under negation because it is a positive polarity item. So by itself, you should always try to scope out negation, as all the positive polarity items do, right? And so this is a big issue, and one of the additional problems is that we haven't really understood why some items are positive polarity items. So you see, the possibility, the conjecture is that the two things are related. So that the reason why certain items are positive polarity items might be related to their interpretation, and specifically to the fact that there is a strong tendency, or at least there is an economy principle or a semantic principle that would tell you that these guys has to move to a higher position. Now, again, this is not really. So Meyer's paper discusses a lot of examples with numerals and stuff, but you see, it's kind of a big problem for the theory, because it's a sort of a it's a sort of a vicious loop where it's hard to get out of, right? So once again, we are taking existential in object position under negation, right? Because we want to explore how likely they're gonna give rise to inverse scope interpretation. But this very item that we are taking is always scoping out of negation. So some way to overcome this problem is not to use negation, right? So you could use, for instance, universal quantifier, or you could use numerals or other stuff and explore this kind of patterns. And I think there was an experiment by Musolino's group investigating the existential and the universal. Right. Mike, do you want to add anything about this? To say anything or?
Well, I think like we should bear in mind the presentation we had last week by Aziz, right? Like about children being tolerant. So at any, like, no matter what the results here say, we have a binary judgment here. So in retrospect, we should question these studies no matter what, right? We have a binary judgment. Children might be more susceptible to being tolerant. So what we have here doesn't really give us anything. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. So you're very skeptical about the methodology they use, basically, and the true value judgment in general. So you're wondering, like, when they give you a 50% response, like in the case of losing the pizzas, right? What can you get out of that? So if they did not understand the sentence at all, they would give you the same 50% as what they provided. So it could be well interpreted as chance, right? But then, of course, the experimenters would say, yeah, but then we asked them what they thought about that, and then they provided some justification for that, and then from that we infer, right? Yeah, so that's definitely true. There are more subtle methodologies to work that out. Whereas, so if there are these issues with indefinites, like some, right? With numerals, it's even worse. With numerals, it's a big mess. Because we haven't really talked about this a lot, right? But numerals can also be interpreted in different ways, like with an exact meaning, or with a sort of existential unbounded meaning, right? So if you have numerals in a potentially ambiguous scopal configuration, if they have an exact interpretation, they will not undergo the same entailment relationship and logical relationship as compared to whether they have an existential interpretation. So if they are existential, they are predicted to behave like some, but if they are specific or exact, they are predicted to behave like that, like definite, like definites, right? So
how can we? I'm sorry. How can we make sure that the numeral has the exact meaning in a given context? How can you be sure?
Well, that's you can't, basically, right? So that's one of the problem, and we also know. I mean, there are some studies, like some of the stuff that I did myself, that show that in certain contexts we do interpret numerals in a weaker way as existentials, especially other studies. And I'm not sure if someone is gonna. Yeah, I think we're gonna talk about that. Because who's going to talk about numerals? Caroline on the 22nd of June is going to tell us something about numerals. So that's going to be the time where we're going to talk about that, which is great. But if we go back to Joanna's slide, if you can show the slide of the experiment of the numerals for a second, Joanna.
This one?
Oh no, sorry.
Another one.
It was, I think it was Annie's slide.
Okay.
I got, sorry. Annie, can you show the slide with the...
I can't on this device, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, so forget about that. I'm gonna do that on the Blackboard, okay? So yeah, let's take a break, okay? And in, let's say 5-7 minutes, we meet again. I do what I wanted to do on the whiteboard, and then we will finally hear something about the fleeting isomorphism effect, okay? So see you in 5-7 minutes.